A thug's hand cut through the air and landed across the face of an 81-year-old man. The sound echoed inside the diner like a gunshot. Plates rattled, forks froze in midair, and silence swallowed the room. No one dared to breathe. No one dared to move. What had just happened was not only an act of violence, but a moment that would burn itself into the memory of every person present. Yet none of them could have known that only an hour later, the door would open again, and someone would walk in who would change everything. Earl Whitman had been sitting at his usual booth by the window, a fragile but steady figure who carried himself with quiet dignity. His back was slightly bent with age, his hands weathered by time, yet his eyes remained sharp, holding the calm of someone who had seen both war and peace. He came to this place each morning, not for excitement, but for the comfort of routine, for the steaming cup of black coffee that waited for him like an old friend. The morning had been peaceful, the smell of bacon and fresh bread hanging in the air, until Trevor Cole stormed in. Trevor wore a leather jacket that clung to his swagger, his boots pounding on the tiles as if he owned every square inch of the floor. He was the kind of man who fed on fear, who looked for weakness and mocked it loudly. When the young waitress dropped a plate, his laugh slashed through the room. His insults followed, sharp and cruel, cutting her down in front of strangers. Earl could not stay silent. He had been a soldier. He had lived through gunfire, through nights when silence meant death and courage meant survival. He had seen men rise to defend one another, even when the cost was their own lives. So he spoke up, steady but firm, telling Trevor to stop. The thug turned, his eyes narrowing. Rage flashed across his face as if Earl's calm defiance had pierced the armor of arrogance he wore. Without a word, Trevor marched across the diner, and before anyone could react, his hand struck. The slap cracked against Earl's cheek, leaving a red mark blooming across his weathered skin. For a heartbeat, the entire diner froze. Chairs squeaked as people shifted uncomfortably, yet no one stood. Some lowered their eyes to their plates. Others turned away, as though pretending not to see would erase what had just happened. The young waitress trembled. Her lips parted, but at no sound coming out. Earl sat still. He did not flinch, nor did he retaliate. His chest rose and fell slowly, and though the sting burned on his face, his gaze remained steady, fixed on the man who had tried to humiliate him. But beneath that calm was a silence heavy with disappointment. He had once believed in the strength of people standing together. Now he looked around and saw only fear keeping them chained to their seats. The room smelled of cowardice more than coffee. Trevor smirked, convinced he had silenced not just one old man, but an entire room. He stood taller, as if claiming the diner as his own territory. The laughter that followed was his victory lap, echoing against walls that had once known only the hum of casual conversation. What no one realized, not even Trevor himself, was that his triumph would be short-lived. That red mark on Earl's cheek would soon become the spark for something far greater. A storm was already gathering beyond those diner walls, and for everyone who watched in silence, that morning would leave them with a memory they could never erase. Because sometimes, a single act of cruelty is not just an insult to one person. It is a test for everyone who witnesses it, a moment that demands courage and reveals who is willing to rise. This was the beginning of Earl Whitman's lesson to a room full of strangers that dignity can stand even when no one else does. If you want to hear what happened when the door finally opened again, stay with us here on Heart Stories, because what follows will remind you why respect is stronger than fear. Trevor Cole stood in the center of the diner like a conqueror who had claimed new land. His chest swelled with pride, his smirk widening with every second of silence that followed his strike. He looked around the room, and no one met his eyes. To him, this was proof that fear worked, that his dominance was unchallenged. The diner had become his stage, and cowardice was his audience. Customers kept their heads down, pushing food around their plates without tasting it. A man in a business suit buried himself in the newspaper, though his trembling fingers betrayed the act. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering something that was meant to calm but carried more fear than comfort. The young waitress who had first drawn Trevor's wrath stood frozen near the counter, her hands clutched so tightly her knuckles turned white. No one wanted to draw attention. No one wanted to be next. Earl Whitman sat quietly in his booth, the sting of the slap still glowing across his weathered cheek. He did not raise his hand to touch it. He let the mark stay, because it wasn't just a wound. It was a symbol. His eyes, steady and thoughtful, scanned the room. He had been a soldier once, and this scene reminded him of nights when silence could be more dangerous than bullets. On the battlefield, silence meant men had lost hope. It meant the enemy had already won. Memories pressed against him. He could see the faces of his fallen brothers in arms. Men who had shouted, who had risen, who had refused to bow even when outnumbered. They had taught him that unity was the shield against cruelty. Yet here, in this simple diner, with no guns, no trenches, no looming death, people sat paralyzed by the power of one man's violence. The weight of their silence was heavier than the sting of Trevor's hand. In the far corner, a young man wearing a baseball cap shifted uneasily in his seat, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the table. For a moment, it looked as though he might stand, as though he might do what no one else dared. But his courage faltered before it reached his legs. He sank back down, the brim of his cap lowered to hide his eyes. Fear had chained him too. Trevor strutted toward the counter, barking for more coffee, acting as though the diner now belonged to him. His laugh filled the room again, shallow and hollow, but it rang loud against the silence of others. Earl closed his eyes briefly. He was not praying for strength for himself. He had carried burdens heavier than this in younger years. Instead, he whispered a single name under his breath, Caleb. It was not just a name, it was a lifeline, a plea that his son, wherever he might be, would find the strength to walk into this storm. Outside, the world moved on unaware, but faintly, from beyond the walls, there was a low growl. At first, it blended with the hum of traffic and the buzz of life on Ashfield's streets, but gradually it grew. A rhythm of engines rolling in unison. The sound vibrated against the diner's glass, like a warning that something was coming closer, something unignorable. A few customers shifted nervously, looking toward the window, but Trevor remained oblivious, basking in his moment of power. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The shame of silence pressed down on everyone like a weight. People avoided one another's gaze, afraid that if their eyes met, they would see reflected the truth that they had allowed an old man to be struck, and none of them had risen to stop it. Earl's mind returned to a different kind of silence, the silence that followed the fall of a friend in battle, when no one dared speak because grief was too raw. Yet this silence was worse. It was not grief, it was surrender. And surrender, he knew, was the seat of oppression. He sat straighter in his booth, his thin frame carrying the gravity of decades lived with integrity. He did not speak again, but the name he had whispered lingered in the air like an unspoken promise. Somewhere out there, Caleb existed, his son, who had fought battles of his own, who had carried scars not from war, but from prejudice. His son, who had learned resilience when the world tried to deny him a place. Earl's hope rested in that name. The rumble outside grew clearer, more defined. The engines drew nearer, weaving together in a thunder that rolled across the streets. Still, no one in the diner fully understood what was about to arrive. They remained trapped in the fog of their own fear, while Trevor relished his false victory. But Earl knew. He could feel it. The sound was not just noise. It was the echo of change approaching. Silence had ruled the diner after the slap, but silence never lasts forever. One way or another, something always comes to break it. And when it does, those who kept their heads down will be forced to reckon with the choice they made to sit in shadows or to stand in the light. The engines roared louder now, no longer a distant hum, but a storm thundering down the street. Windows rattled in their frames, and cups on tables trembled as if the sound itself carried weight. The customers glanced at one another uneasily, but Trevor Cole dismissed it with a scoff. He lifted his coffee like a man celebrating his conquest, oblivious to the change creeping closer with every rev of the throttle. The door swung open, and the storm entered. Caleb Whitman stepped inside, his boots striking the tiled floor with measured force. He filled the doorway, not by sheer size, but by presence. His broad shoulders were smudged with grease from the morning's work at the garage, his hands scarred from years of labor. Yet he carried himself with the strength of someone who had weathered more than physical battles. His chest bore a small patch stitched into his jacket, a symbol that to outsiders meant rebellion, but to him meant family. Behind him, the Hells Angels filed in. Their leather jackets glistened beneath the diner's pale lights, their tattoos like banners of survival. To some, they were menacing, a pack of wolves stepping into sheep's territory. But to Caleb, they were brothers, the only ones who had embraced him when the world turned its back, when he had spoken the truth of who he was, when his town sneered, when whispers followed him through narrow streets. These men had offered him a seat at their table. They had not asked him to hide. They had not demanded silence. They had accepted him as their own. Caleb's eyes swept the room, and then they locked on Earl. His father sat still, his cheeks still glowing red from Trevor's strike. That mark was like fire in Caleb's chest. His breath deepened, his jaw tightened, and the room seemed to shrink under the intensity of his gaze. Trevor's smirk faltered. For the first time since he entered the diner, uncertainty crept across his face. He shifted in his seat, straightening his jacket as if to remind himself of the image he wanted to project. But the laughter that had once filled his throat now died before it could form. The Hells Angels did not speak. They stood behind Caleb like a wall of steel, their silence more powerful than any words. The air thickened, pressing down on Trevor, who found himself sweating though the room was cool. His earlier bravado, the swagger that had made him slap an old man without hesitation, seemed brittle now, cracking under the weight of something he could not name. Earl raised his eyes to his son. For a brief moment, he saw not just Caleb the biker, not just the man hardened by prejudice and strengthened by resilience, but the boy he had once held, the boy who had chosen a road of his own making, pride mixed with sorrow in his chest. He wished the world had been kinder to Caleb, wished acceptance had not been so hard won. Yet in that moment, he was grateful because every scar had prepared his son for this. The diner held its breath. Forks lay abandoned on plates. Conversations stilled mid-word. All eyes turned toward the confrontation forming in the center of the room. The once invisible hum of fear had shifted, now replaced by a tension so sharp it could cut. Trevor forced a grin, though his lips quivered. He leaned back in his chair, trying to feign calm, but his fingers drummed nervously against the table, betraying him. He had dealt with men who shouted, men who swung fists wildly, men who hid behind numbers. But Caleb's quiet fury, his controlled presence, was something else entirely. It stripped Trevor of his illusion of power, leaving him exposed. Caleb stepped forward, his boots echoing with each measured stride. He said nothing yet, but his silence carried the weight of promise. It told Trevor that the days of unchecked cruelty had met their reckoning. The customers sat straighter. Some who had kept their eyes down now dared to look up. They saw not just a son entering for his father, but a man who embodied the courage they had lacked. The sound of engines outside had announced him, but it was his presence that filled the diner with a new kind of air. Not fear, but possibility. Trevor's confidence drained with every second, and though he still clung to arrogance, the ground beneath him was slipping fast. And as Earl watched his son stand tall in that diner, he understood something deeper. Strength was not always about fists or fury. Sometimes it was about the dignity of arrival, the quiet power of standing firm, the courage to walk into a room and face down hatred with nothing but the certainty of belonging. That day, Caleb carried more than his own story through the diner door. He carried the lesson that true family is not bound by blood or judgment, but by those who choose to see you, accept you, and stand with you when the world demands you sit down. The diner felt like a stage where every breath carried weight, every glance mattered. Caleb Whitman now stood face to face with Trevor Cole, and though only inches separated them, it felt as if the entire room hung in the space between. The hum of the Hells Angels behind Caleb was steady and unbroken, a wall of resolve that filled the diner without a single raised fist. Their presence was not violent, but absolute. Caleb's voice was low, controlled, sharp as tempered steel. "That's my father. He doesn't need to prove strength to you, but I will show you what respect means." The words did not echo loudly, yet they cut through the diner more forcefully than any shout could have. Trevor's smirk wavered. The bravado he wore like armor began to crack as the weight of Caleb's presence bore down on him. He shifted his feet, his body betraying the fear his mouth still tried to disguise. Behind Caleb, the angels remained motionless. Their stillness was a kind of warning silent, immovable, undeniable. Trevor glanced past Caleb at the wall of leather and steel, and his hands twitched against his thighs. His arrogance had always thrived where others were silent. But silence in this moment was no longer weakness. It was strength. It was power. Earl Whitman placed a trembling but deliberate hand on his son's arm. His voice carried the wisdom of age, tempered by years of battles fought not only on fields of war, but in the quieter wars of life. "Control yourself, son. Do not let strength turn into violence." The old man's words sank into Caleb like water on fire. The fury burning in him softened into something sharper, something more purposeful. His father was right. This was not about fists meeting flesh. It was about dignity, outlasting cruelty. Caleb drew a breath, deep and steady, and stepped closer to Trevor, closing the distance not with a punch but with presence. Trevor's throat bobbed as he swallowed. The air around him thickened. He could feel not just Caleb's eyes on him, but the eyes of every customer in the diner. People who had been silent, bowed by fear, were now watching. Their silence no longer belonged to him. It was turning, shifting, becoming something else entirely. The first to rise was the young man in the baseball cap. His chair scraped loudly across the floor as he stood, his chin lifted, his gaze fixed firmly on Trevor. Then, as though a current had passed through the room, others followed. A man in a business suit laid down his paper and stood tall. The mother who had hidden her child drew him closer but raised her own face without fear. The waitress stepped out from behind the counter, her hands no longer trembling. One by one, the room transformed. Where there had been bowed heads, there were now lifted chins. Where there had been avoidance, there was now defiance. Trevor looked around and realized that the ground he stood on had vanished. The power he had clutched only moments ago was gone, replaced by a tide of resistance he could not control. Caleb's eyes never left his. He took one final step, close enough that Trevor could see the reflection of himself in Caleb's unflinching stare. There was no rage there, no desire for blood. Only a strength that came from knowing who he was, and knowing that the room, once filled with silence, now stood with him. Trevor's shoulders sagged under the invisible weight pressing down on him. His lips parted, but no words came. The swagger that had carried him into the diner collapsed into something hollow. Earl's hand remained steady on his son's arm, a reminder that restraint is sometimes the greatest show of power. Caleb did not raise his fists. He did not need to. Respect was not won through violence. It was demanded by the presence of truth, by the sight of people finally standing together. In that moment the diner became more than a place for food. It became a lesson written into every witness's heart that when cruelty tries to claim victory, courage need not shout or strike. Sometimes, courage is simply standing tall, unbroken, and refusing to yield. And the truest strength is not in the power to dominate, but in the discipline to hold back when dominance is within reach. Trevor Cole's bravado crumbled. His lips twitched as though words might escape, but only silence fell from him. The room had shifted entirely. Where once fear had bent every head, now defiance stood in unison. He glanced around at the customers who stared back with steady eyes. The waitress no longer trembled. The mother no longer hid her child. The businessman no longer used his newspaper as a shield. Trevor was alone, exposed under the weight of collective courage. His legs trembled as he stepped backward. the smirk gone from his face. His body language betrayed what his tongue could not admit. He wanted to leave, to disappear before this moment swallowed him whole. He turned slightly toward the door, ready to make his escape. But before he could move, the young man in the baseball cap stood fully upright. The sound of his chair scraping the floor was louder than any word spoken. He stepped forward, pulling the cap from his head. His face was young, but his eyes carried bruises older than his years. The diner watched in silence as he spoke, his voice raw, carrying pain that had been buried too long. He revealed that he had once been Trevor's lover, back when courage meant secrecy and hope meant risk. Instead of love, Trevor had given him violence. He described nights of hiding, nights of fear, the shame Trevor inflicted upon him for daring to live openly. The truth cut through the room like shattered glass, sharp and undeniable. Gasps rippled across the diner. Shock painted every face. Trevor's cruelty was no longer hidden behind swagger. His violence had not been born of strength, but of weakness to accept himself. Weakness to live without hiding behind fists. Caleb Whitman's eyes narrowed, though the fire of anger in him dimmed to something more profound. He saw Trevor not as a towering enemy, but as a hollow man running from his own reflection. His voice was calm when he spoke, the steadiness of it carrying further than rage ever could. You didn't strike my father because you were strong. You struck him because you're terrified of the truth about yourself. Trevor's chest heaved. He searched for a reply, but none came. His arrogance had been stripped bare. He turned sharply, stumbling toward the door, and this time no one lowered their head as he passed. No one looked away. The people he had once commanded with fear now stood taller because of his fall. Earl Whitman lifted his hand to the mark still faintly visible on his cheek. He did not touch it, but he smiled faintly at his son. Caleb had not raised his fists, and yet he had won, not only for himself or his father, but for every silent witness who found their voice that morning. The diner slowly returned to life. Coffee cups were lifted again, chairs scraped back into place, but something fundamental had changed. Fear no longer ruled those four walls. Respect had taken its place. And beneath it all was a lesson as old as humanity itself, that strength is not found in domination, but in truth. That silence can be broken when even one person dares to rise. And that living honestly, even when the world resists it, is the truest form of courage. Now I want to hear from you. If you had been in that diner, would you have stood when Caleb did? Or would fear have kept you seated? Share your thoughts below. And if stories like this move you, make sure to follow Heart Stories, because here, every story reminds us that dignity, respect, and courage are stronger than hate.